Bonjour, guten Tag, hello, buenos dias, and welcome to this discussion within the framework of the series Radical Diversity, presented by several Goethe-Institut locations in North America, in collaboration with its Goethe pop-ups, the Thomas Mann House, the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity, and under the sponsorship of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung North America. My name is Caroline Gagnon, and I am coordinator of the cultural program at the Goethe-Institut in Montreal. The discussion today will be taking place in English, but before we start, let me say a few words to our French and Spanish-speaking audience. Bonjour et bienvenue à cette discussion intitulée Radical Diversity. L'entretien d'aujourd'hui aura lieu en anglais, mais vous pouvez bénéficier d'une traduction simultanée en français en cliquant sur le bouton Interprétation dans la partie inférieure de l'écran Zoom. Buenos días y bienvenidos a esta discusión titulada Radical Diversity. El diálogo de hoy será en inglés, pero puede tener traducción simultánea en español. Solo tiene que hacer clic en el botón traducción en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. In our discussion today in Montreal, political reporter Mohamed Amjahid speaks with art historian Charmaine Nelson about white knowledge production, looking back from a Black Canadian perspective, and about a new era for anthropology and social sciences. Mohamed Amjahid studied political science in Berlin and Cairo and conducted research on various anthropological projects in North America. He is working as a political reporter for the weekly newspapers Die Zeit and Das Zeit magazine. Anthropologically and journalistically, Mohamed Amjahid focuses on human rights, equality, and upheaval in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So without any further delay, Mohamed, je te cède la parole.
Merci Caroline. Bonjour Canada. I'm very, very thrilled and happy to be able to talk today to Charmaine. Let me introduce Charmaine Nelson very briefly. Charmaine Nelson is a professor of art history at the McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She's working and teaching there since 2003. Her research and teaching interests include post-colonial and Black feminism scholarship, transatlantic slavery studies, and Black diaspora studies. Her research and teaching explores various types of high and low art. Maybe you can explain to us what that means later, and popular art forms, including TV, film, photography, print, sculpture, painting, and dress. And in the beginning, I would love to talk with you, Charmaine, a little bit about positionalities. There is still a big discussion, at least here in Germany, in social science and anthropology, about especially if positionality is and should be something important doing research. Mm-hmm. Some scholars would argue, a lot of them white scholars, that positionality shouldn't play any role. Some others would say it's really, really important and you cannot start actually looking at any field if you don't do that. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Mohamed. And I apologize, but I actually provided an old bio. I've actually resigned from McGill, and I now teach at Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University. And I just want to say that because if in case anyone wants to follow up with me and find me later, you'll find me now in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And part of the reason, the motivation for me to come here, because I've been at McGill, I was at McGill for 17 years, was because I was offered a research chair. So I have more research time now. And also, Mohamed, I'll be launching the first ever institute for the study of Canadian slavery. So that's something we're building right now. So I'm sure we'll talk a bit.
Congratulations. Congratulations,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, but thank you so much. Yeah. But to your important question, positionality, for me, this resonates, Mohamed, in a couple of multiple levels. First, positionality of the subjects we study. So for me, I study often unfree Black people. So people who were diasporic Black people, meaning they were the 12 million who survived the Middle Passage and transatlantic slavery. They survived the slave ships and were scattered from Argentina to Canada, throughout the Caribbean, and some were forced to go back to Europe. So when I'm studying unfree people, people who are enslaved, you have to think about their positionality. I mean, it's permeates every aspect of how you do the research too, because as unfree people, for instance, Mohamed, they're never documented like free people, meaning what? For instance, I'm never looking for a birth certificate because they simply were not issued for enslaved people. So things like that, if you don't think of positionality with in the subject matter when you're dealing with like populations, you're just going to be off track all the time. Positionality too, for me, Mohamed, speaks to myself as a Black female scholar, what I bring to the table that is unique and distinct, let's say from my white male colleagues, my white female colleagues, a Black male colleague, for instance. And of course, gender, sex, sexuality, you know, class, all that experience you bring to the table. And it, of course, is the lens through which we approach and look at our research and the lens through which we develop our questions. Like, so how are we going to pretend that's not true? So for instance, Mohamed, there's a painting that people who know my research know I've been obsessed with this painting from 1786 for years called, it was circulated for years under the name Portrait of a Negro Slave. It's a portrait though. So the artist was a slave owner who owned this woman. Of course he knew her name, but the name didn't become the title of the work as is common with images of free white people. So why do I say this? My positionality mattered, Mohamed, because for years, other white male scholars had written about this portrait, but in their publications, they never bothered to ask a very simple question: what is her name? What is her name? That is the question of portraiture, because usually, again, the title of the portrait is the name of the sitter, isn't the person who's represented. So it was my identity as a Black woman. When I look at the portrait, I see my ancestor. So how could I not?
Would you say that you are maybe more qualified to do this research because of your positionality? Because that's also a question coming from white scholars often asking me, am I not allowed to go to the Middle East anymore and do anthropology there?
Well, it's not that I'm more qualified. I think one of the things I strive for with my students, so I'm also now as a scholar of transatlantic slavery. And, you know, I look mainly at Anglo-Caribbean like Jamaica, and I also look at places like Canada. I strive to, Mohamed, to develop an ethical practice of scholarship. So what does it mean to be in the position to be able to try to recuperate the words, the thoughts, the experiences of a population, right, these enslaved people who were not allowed to leave traces of themselves because they had no leisure time, because they were being worked to death, because they were prohibited from learning to read and write. What does it mean for me today to be in that position? So I say to my students, listen, if you read about transatlantic slavery and there's not moments where you have to pause and put down the journal or put down the book, and there's not a moment where you're crying because it's so horrid, then don't do the research. Like, please do not stay in the field if you're unaffected by the suffering of millions of people, right? I think so. In that sense, I think anybody can do the research. And here's the thing, slavery is often coded as a Black history in order to dismiss it. And what happens in a place like Canada is Canadians don't want to talk about the slavery at all. They don't know that slavery transpired in Canada for over 200 years, the average Canadian. They want to talk about the Underground Railroad. They want to talk about 30 years when African Americans were fleeing north. But why do I say this? So the thing is too about positionality is we have a nation in Canada that is just willing to erase and raise 200 years of history. So that history, though, is a complex, multiracial, multi-ethnic history. It's not just a Black history. Who was a slave owner? Who was a ship captain? Who was a crew member of the ship? Who was a West Indian merchant? They're all white men for the most part. How is that not your history? How's that not the history of a white man in Nova Scotia today, right? How does he not know that his ancestors are connected to that? So I don't believe that we should go down the path of, you know, this is just for certain groups or this history is just for certain groups. To me, it's about the ethical practice that you bring to it. And what is your goal? What is your intention when you do the research? And mine is to recuperate again, the experiences of the enslaved.
And maybe later we can also talk about this image of Canada that you just mentioned, because all the times when I was in Canada, I mean, people told me how nice it is, and Canadians are nice. But maybe later we can talk about that too.
Please, let's talk about it, because it depends. Like, which Canadians do you talk about? Are you talking to, right, Mohamed? If you talk to Black Canadians, people of color Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, will tell you what our experience is, which is not that it's great and sunny all the time. It's not.
It's
right?
certainly not sunny all the time. That was what I learned. But maybe let's stay a little bit, because we just talked about positionality. There's an amazing book written by Linda Smith. She's a professor from New Zealand. It's called Decolonizing Methodologies. And she's actually describing the role of non-white researchers in a white-dominated social science area. And she describes non-white researchers as native informants. So these are people who are supposed to carve information for the white knowledge productions. And my question is, when you talk to your students, you just mentioned your students, when you talk to your non-white students, what do you tell them how they can get out of this cycle to be used in a system that works like it works? There are power shifts, there is white gaze. What do you recommend, especially for young researchers, how they can get out of this?
Right. Wow, that's a great question. So I guess, first of all, I always say to my non-white students, right, please think of art history as a discipline to which you can contribute, that you might have a future by doing an MA, by doing a PhD, by becoming a curator. Because what I found during my, my career, first I started at Western for 2 years, Western University in London, Ontario, then 17 years at McGill. Art history is incredibly unattractive to people of color students. A lot of the people of color students, and I'm talking Asian students, Arab students, Black students, Indigenous students, and others, who would find my courses, they found my courses as an elective, Mohamed, and maybe I should explain for people who are not in the Canadian or US system. The way it's set up is you do a 4-year, typically undergrad degree, where you have to declare a major concentration, which would mean at a place like McGill, 12 courses. And you typically do 4 classes a semester, so 8 classes a year. So to have a major concentration, you end up doing 12 courses in that field. So most of my people of color students did not declare a major in art history. They passed by and did elective, because you have allowed to do a certain amount of electives where you're more playing and experimenting. So they came to find me and then they left. And I understand why, because the rest of my department or the rest of art history to them was not attractive to them, because they couldn't see or find themselves within that. So part of what I try to do is remind them that to not be afraid of the absence of themselves in the discipline, that you have a right to decide what type of art, what style of art, what region, what period you want to explore, and that your questions are valid. So even if the discipline at the present doesn't look like you want it to look like, you have a role in shaping the discipline and doing the research. And sometimes that's not the same two things. Right. So there's moments when as a scholar, I write about the discipline of art history and what I want to change. And there's other moments where I just find the art object or the artist and I do the deep dive into analyzing those. So I make it clear to students that part of your responsibility is actually to critique the discipline and to pry it open so that you fit. And that's not something someone else is going to do. That's something you have to do.
Like you did with asking why they didn't ask about the name of that woman.
Right.
Actually, it's always a position yourself to what was written in the literature like 20 years ago, 50 years ago.
Exactly.
What are the reactions of your non-white students? What are their experiences?
I'd say that, okay, so if I think about McGill, typically in an undergrad class, let's say a third year class, there might be anywhere from 80 to 100 students. And I tell you, Mohamed, I was lucky if I had 10 people of color, I mean, everybody together, Indigenous, Black, Arab, everybody Asian, 10 students and 90 white out of 100. So they were completely outnumbered all the time. So that's why it was important too, to say that to them. Right? So they see me at the front of the class, which is good because then for many of them, instantly they know, oh, I can do that because she looks like me, right? She is me. So I take that responsibility too as being a mentor for them and being embodiment of them very seriously. But I think their experiences outside of my class were often very negative. And again, it's nothing against my other my colleagues, but many of them teach. Although their analysis is quite critical and sophisticated, I think some of them fall into the typical trap of Western art history. Well, art history is Western, so that's redundant. But what I mean, Mohamed, is this is, if anybody knows anything about art history, it's a very canonical and Eurocentric field. And the way it's organized is by both period and region. So what does that mean? My department, like many in North America, has what? We have a Renaissance Italy scholar, right? So the thing is, why do we assume that the person who's teaching art from the 16th century has to focus on Italy? Nothing else is going on in the rest of the world. Only Italy in the 16th century, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So Renaissance Italy. Then we have a 17th century Dutch scholar. Then we have an 18th century British, and then you can guess there's a 19th century French scholar. Right? Then we have a contemporary scholar. Then I'm kind of floating. I was floating because I was hired as a historical Canadianist, but they got more than they bargained for with me, Mohamed, because I also do all this Black diaspora stuff. That's not what I was hired to do. Right? That's what I brought along with, my knowledge base, but I was hired to teach Canadian art prior to 1950. Right? And you're only
so that the university wanted you to do that research because they understood that there is this blind spot?
They did not want me to do Black diaspora. I was not hired to do that. No. That was a bonus for them. I don't think they realized how much of my research focus and teaching would be that, right? But I gave, when I was hired, I gave the lecture on this portrait I just mentioned, the 18th century portrait, which is a Canadian portrait by a French-Canadian artist. And so I got hired as a Canadianist, but I was also able to deliver content on the Black diaspora. So I was able to enhance the course offering because the rest of the department was basically completely European focused, except for one colleague who teaches East Asian art. And McGill's not extraordinary. Sadly, that's what a lot of art history departments look like in Canada and the USA. They might have one person who teaches something that's not fundamentally based on European or Euro-American art and visual culture.
Right. I had once a course in art history, and of course they took us to Italy, which I love. Italy is an amazing country, but you make a very important point that
there's these typical locations and regions that are expected in our history.
Because it's the basis maybe of the discipline as it exists, like
but they're arbitrary choices, right? They're arbitrary choices, because here's the thing, and here's the problem too, Mohamed. Many of my colleagues and many people in the field, for instance, they teach 17th century Dutch as if the Dutch was a nation. Hello, it's an empire in the 17th century. They're in Suriname, where else? They're in Curacao. How do you get away with teaching 17th century Dutch as if it's not an empire? How do you get away with teaching 18th century British as if it's not an empire? Like the British aren't in Jamaica at that point, so you can't open the door to teaching about like Jamaican art, right? Or the white Caribbeans even who went to produce art in Jamaica. So this is the thing too, like this false idea that you're looking at Europe in the moments of empire building and pretending that they were only nations, right? I mean, while some of the art that you're examining, right, through this Eurocentric lens, was created to represent things that are going on in empire, or created through the money that came back from empire, and you're still not acknowledging it.
Yeah, right.
It's ridiculous.
I just wanted to remind the audience that they can submit questions in the Q&A section. Let's maybe move to another topic, because I just had the feeling when we talked briefly about Canada, there's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
Let's go for it.
Whoa.
Look,
How much time do you have, Mohamed?
I'm willing to sit here all night. It's a very dark night here in Berlin. But I was in Canada in 2012 for the first time. And I arrived, I was on Air Canada, on the airplane, and I arrived in Vancouver, actually. And I had in mind, I was very young, and I had in mind Canada, that's this very, very nice country where they welcome you with open arms. I don't know where I got this idea, maybe from a TV series or something. And the first thing that I saw in Canada was jail in the Vancouver airport, because the person working with the border control saw me immediately as a non-white person coming out from the airplane and asked me to follow her to a space where that was full with people of color, with people from all over the world, from Asian countries, from the Middle East, and one very tall white dude who was yelling that he's American and he should not be there in this space. So I spent there like 8 hours or something. It was like a nasty experience, but I really learned something that sometimes image also, which is transported through pop culture and arts, is something that you should at least go and check in reality. So how is it for you working as a Black woman, Canadian scholar, to deal with this image that I would guess a lot of people around the world believe Canada is? I don't know.
Mohamed, that's such a rich question. Okay, so I'm going to approach it at multiple levels here. First of all, I travel a lot. I lecture a lot in the USA, for instance. I travel quite a bit to Europe. When I go to Europe, for instance, I sound like this, people immediately assume I'm American. And what that tells me as well is they don't warn the people in Europe in general, unless you're, let's say, a British Black person with Jamaican ancestry who has relatives in Toronto, right? I'm talking about a lot of white people in Europe don't realize that Canada even has a significant Black population, and that many of the Blacks here we'd call African Canadian, and they have 6, 7, 8 generations deep in the nation. They go back to the period of slavery in Canada. So that knowledge too, can I tell you, is something that white Canadians also don't know. So
don't know or don't want to know?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. How do you not know, right? So if you live here, right, and you're actually interacting with someone outside of your own communities. But the thing is then what happens to us, Mohamed, is amongst ourselves, Black Canadians kind of, we have to shrug it off, or we, I don't know what else we can do, but we get asked constantly by our fellow white citizens, where are you from? I have to point out, I have the most typical English, Canadian, Central Canada, like Ontario accent imaginable. Like I could easily be a news broadcaster. This is the accent they want on TV. This is the accent we export to America. A lot of American newscasters who've made it to the top are actually Canadians, and they sound like this. So when a white Canadian asks me where I'm from, it's not based on how I'm speaking, right? It's based on how I'm looking to them. But part of that is their ignorance in that they don't understand that African Canadian populations go back multiple centuries to the 1700s and 1600s in Canada, so that I could be more Canadian than them, right? And they're not asking me basically, I don't believe they're asking me about the specificity of my, background in terms of African Canadianness. I think they're looking for me to name another nation other than Canada as my home.
Your migration background,
exactly,
actually, which is a very German thing. to do, to ask you where you're from.
Yeah, so it's a constant expulsion of you and a delegitimization of your access to Canadianness. How this plays out in Canadian academia, here's the thing. It's, within the last, I think, 4 months or something, Pierre, I'm saying his father. This is how old I am. Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, came out and said, listen, Canada is suffering from systemic racism. This isn't just about the USA and other places, right? It happens here too. There's anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism against other communities. Can I tell you how huge that was? Like, this is unfathomable that, first of all, some of the other parties, like the Conservatives, would ever open their mouths and admit to this. Okay. And that to have at the highest office finally admit this, we were all going like, where are we? Because as people of color Canadians, this is a constant kind of butting of heads for us and a denial of our reality as people who suffer daily from, and not just microaggressions, just all out pure in your face aggression and the same types of systemic bias that you see and read about in the USA in terms of over policing, hyper surveillance, violent encounters with the police. We're more likely to die at the hands of the police. We're charged differently for the same crimes than white people. All of it, like we're treated differently in the hospital setting or healthcare access, education, everything. And what this looks like for me as a Black female academic, it's absurd, actually, Mohamed. Listen, McGill that I just left is one of the biggest universities in Canada. It's also always in the top 2 of Canada in terms of the best universities. University of Toronto in Toronto or McGill University in Montreal. When I left, Mohamed, there were 1,726 tenure or tenure track faculty, meaning those about to become permanent or those who are permanent. Okay, 1,726. Of those, there were 10 of us who were Black. 10. So when I left, 10% of Black faculty, I am 10% walking out the door. That's 0.5%. Now in the USA, say what you want about the States, a university like that, performing like that would just be sued. The state would take over. They would force them to have certain numbers that they'd have to implement in a certain amount of time. They would be audited. That is catastrophic underrepresentation. And when you think about that, why this is so appalling too, is that McGill University was actually founded by a slave owner. James McGill was a slave owner. He was also a West Indian merchant, meaning what? He was actually importing rum, sugar, and molasses from the Anglo-Caribbean to Montreal. So he was actually actively exploiting enslaved people in places like Jamaica and Barbados. And he was a slave owner of Indigenous and Black people in Montreal. So for that university not to have a reckoning with that history, and it's coming up on its 200th year anniversary, 2021, McGill University will turn 200. So just to close here, sorry, but this is such an urgent topic for me too. What it feels like is a constant barrage of racism to be in that position because you're constantly being misrecognized. So there's a whole slew of people, staff, faculty, students who don't recognize me as a professor when I enter the campus of a McGill University. And why would they? Because people like me who look like me are not professors at that university. So the white students, how they're getting totally, the education they're receiving too is appalling because they're being taught that only people who look like them are knowledge bearers. Only people who look like them are cultural producers, right?
It's actually the same situation in Germany, but still I'm wondering how did Canada manage to have that image? Like, because people would be like very surprised you telling this perspective.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised. You know what? So for me, it's the several puzzle pieces, Mohamed. One is that, all right, Canadian slavery goes from the 1600s under the French and the British, from Ontario, the province of Ontario, eastward. So Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, where I am now, and then Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland. All of it practiced slavery. Quebec changed hands. So first it was colonized by France, then by Britain. But all those regions were slaving, meaning chattel slavery, transatlantic slavery. All right. Canada abolished slavery in 1834, not because the slave owners here were more benevolent, because Britain passed an act of Parliament in London, England, and said everywhere in our empire needs to stop. And remember, we, during the Revolutionary War in the USA, Canada remained loyal to Britain. So we were still a British holding, right? So we had to stop practicing slavery when Britain outlawed it. So 1834. Okay. The period then after that, African-American enslaved people, of course, come to know this fact. They run north into Canada across the border to freedom, but only after 1834 does that hold true. That keeps up until 1865, which is the end of the American Civil War. So only for 31 years, you have African-Americans fleeing north. Before that, Mohamed, can I point out, what you find in the archives is that enslaved people are running back and forth across what becomes the Canada-US border, not because they're trying to get to a free state, but because they're just trying to get away from their slave owner. People don't realize that. A lot of Canadian enslaved people fled south into the USA to escape the slave owner, right? But at 1834, you do have thousands of African Americans that run north for 31 years to get into Canada, because to cross that border at that point, you're free. What Canada has done to Mohamed is enshrined 30 years. That's all we study. Every Black History Month, which is here in February, that's all the teachers know to trot out. Elementary school, high school. My students tell me from grade 2. So from when they're about 7, they're being taught about the Underground Railroad, those 30 years. So that positions us as the great white abolitionists who saved the Black Americans. What we don't teach is the 200 years when we were slaving. Do you see the disparity there? It's ridiculous. So we erased 200 years when we were also slave owning, slave trading, etc. We enshrine 31 years when we are the good guys.
When you say we, you mean?
Really, this is the way that Euro-Canadians want it to be taught. This is the way they've entrenched it. This is the way they've written it. So they've actually listen, right after slavery ends, you have some late 19th, early 20th century scholars who start to write about how Canadian slavery was very benevolent. It wasn't. They have a stake in this, right? They want to make it so. And then you have the myth too that less enslaved people somehow meant that they were better treated, which is just a complete lie. So this is another thing that you find in Canada. You have a lot of white Canadians who want to argue when they admit that slavery happened here, the first place they go is the slaves must have been treated better because there were fewer of them. And I'm always like, how did you come up with that? What about trauma as a form of coming from isolation, from self and from community, right? When you're totally outnumbered and there's one of two of you in a household, if you're born in Africa and you end up in Quebec City, who can you speak your language to? Who remembers how to groom your hair? Who remembers how to wrap your head? Who remembers your spirituality? That's a form of ongoing trauma for Black people who ended up in a place like Halifax, Quebec City, Montreal. So that's another myth that was propagated really close to the end of slavery in Canada, in the way that mainly white male scholars began to write about Canadian slavery. And then others began to write and focus just on the Underground Railroad. Until today, what we've inherited then is curriculum across the board, Mohamed, from elementary school through high school to where I teach in universities. They're bereft of the study of Canadian slavery.
But then also this this image and this myth, you find it in other kinds of pop cultural products. For example, Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale, like the Promised Land, where all the women can flee and be free, also the Black woman can be free, is Canada, basically, which was interesting for me because, yes, it makes sense that you say Euro-Canadians, they really worked hard on this image, but also from the outside, a lot of white people, they just see this promised land in this nation of Canada where you can be yourself and, I don't know, never experience anything like racism or sexism, for example.
Right. I think part of it too is, listen, we have under Pierre Trudeau, I'm getting the name right now, Justin's father, the beginning of a multiculturalism policy at the federal level, which said, okay, we're going to acknowledge now that the country is not just French and British people. right? We have a lot more diversity than that. So because we have an official multicultural policy, people assume that everything's just great for all the people of color here, and it's not, because the way that that policy is played out is that it's impacted us the most, I think, in arts and culture, right? But in certain sectors, whereas it hasn't made a dent in things like, let's say, employment equity, in things like corporate Canada, academia, right? Other business sectors, et cetera. It hasn't made a dent. Like the types of atrocious numbers I'm talking about for Black academics in Canada, McGill's not alone, right? That one of the Canada's national newspapers just had a report about how corporate boards in Canada, similarly dismal numbers. The Black people are not on corporate boards in Canada. They're not being asked to sit on corporate boards in Canada, regardless of our training and qualifications. So part of it, I think, is the myth of slavery as being milder when we admit to it all. The myth of the Underground Railroad as being the only Black history we want to talk about, right? And that positions us as benevolent abolitionists. And then couple that with a modern introduction of multiculturalism. And can I throw in there too, Mohamed, where it connects to what I do more profoundly? If you look at the media landscape in Canada, it's nothing compared to the dominance of the USA. And we get all American TV all the time. Like if you go and try to get a Canadian sign up to have cable TV in your home, they automatically offer you packages of American channels. That's just how it is in Canada. All right. But the knock-on effect of that is, in terms of Canadian TV production, and let's face it, for many Canadians and foreigners who are watching Canada, how they come to know Canadian history is through things like a TV show or a movie. There's been, I think, one syndicated sitcom about Black Canadians ever on TV. One. So you can't even compare it to, like, in the USA, we have Fresh Prince, we have historically the Jeffersons, we had Good Times, we had The Cosby Show. You have all these things to draw on in terms of, if you're a white American thinking, I don't know any Black people, what are Black people like? You turn on the TV, you have at least some semblance of a diverse depiction. It's not good. I'm telling you, there's a lot of stereotypes and horror there too. They get it wrong most of the time. But there were some opportunities for you to see Black people in the middle and upper classes living a good life, raising their children, two-parent households, et cetera. Canadian content doesn't give us that. So as Black Canadians, we're looking to America to find ourselves, right? And we are not Americans. So for instance, the dominant population of Black Canadians are actually of English, Caribbean background. That's the biggest population, like Jamaicans, Barbadians, Trinidadians, that's the biggest population. We outnumber at this point the African Canadians who have the multi-generations that go back to the period of slavery. So we don't see ourselves on TV. When we turn on the American TV, we see African Americans depicted. That is not us. That is not our culture. What they're eating is not what we eat, for instance. That's not our food culture. That's not our music culture. But you see what I'm saying? So we are not given a chance as Black media producers in Canada to export our vision of ourselves to the world or even to our nation. So part of this is a deficit too, you see, Mohamed.
What about in the arts? Because someone is asking that we are not talking about the arts. What about when you look at, for example, contemporary arts scenes? Do you see that diverse society that Canada is in this art scene?
Black people in Canada, Black Canadian contemporary artists have been almost completely shut out of mainstream Canadian art. The mainstream Canadian art world. So that's changing a little bit more right now but listen, can we be real? McGill University announced, I think in the summer, at the end of the summer, that they're going to hire now in a two-tier fashion. They're aiming to hire about 80 Black professors by 2030. Why are they doing that? Part of the reason, because my undergrad students and I wrote a 97-page report about James McGill slave owning and its connection to the university, and then did a media blitz. And basically, they got a lot of bad media attention for how horrific their numbers are, right? And there's also people, the Black students within McGill have been agitating. So none of this is coming about because the upper administration is nice or wants to do the right thing. It's pressure. It's pressure. Same thing's happening in the museum world now. There's some pressure going on, but by and large, for instance, to date, there's one, I'd say, significant gallery in Canada that's devoted only to African Canadian or Black Canadian art, one in the whole nation. There's absolutely no equivalent, let's say, to Washington, D.C. Smithsonian Museum for African American history and culture, nowhere near it. Nowhere close. We have some interesting and excellent community museums in places like Amherstburg, Ontario, but typically they're underfunded, they're understaffed, and they don't get the proper support from any levels of government. So we are.
Is it more a philanthropic American system where you have like donors, or is it more state-based?
I'd say it's more state-based because actually we don't have. Here's the thing. In the USA, let's be frank, you know, there are significant amounts, because their population is much bigger than ours. They're 300 plus million. We are 36 million. But because too, you have significant industries where Black people have made significant inroads, like the arts and entertainment, like professional athletics, like media. You have people like an Oprah Winfrey, who, if someone can't get a film done, there's a chance they could get to her and say, Oprah, can you give me a couple $1 million? And you can lend me space in your, like there's someone you can ask. There's multiple people. There's a Tyler Perry, there's an Oprah Winfrey, right? There's like Michael Jordan, like there's people who have money. There's right? So, and people who, there's a lot of Black people who are in the USA too, who are, and not just Black people, but who are major collectors of African-American art. Like their focus in their personal collections is Black American artists, and they intend to cede those collections to reputable established museums. No, there's no comparison in Canada. There's no comparison in Canada, right? I just got back from a major maritime museum where—
A major what museum, sorry?
A museum in the Maritimes, okay? In the 4 provinces that make up Atlantic Canada. And I don't want to out them, so I won't say which one, but I think there's going to be similar in other places. But, you know, they're showing me different aspects of their collection because they know my interest in representation of Black people and also in the production of Black Canadians. And I said to them, do you have any art from any period by Black Canadians? Nothing, not one thing, not one painting, not one, nothing. Right? And this is a museum that collects historically and contemporaneously. Not one thing by a Black producer. That sadly is not uncommon. It's not uncommon. Like, but how do you get away with that? How do you get away with that? Right? You get away by that by constantly thinking of, you know, population like Black Canadians of not being a part of the Canadian fabric, of not being a part of the Canadian narrative. And here's the thing, Mohamed, it's connected back to the dismissal of Canadian slavery, because if you understand that slavery happened here, you understand that Black people have been in Canada since the 1600s. So you have to acknowledge the long presence of Black Canadians. And then you begin, as a person like me, to start to look for the art and cultural production in those earlier periods because you know it existed. Right? But if you don't even know— Which
costs you a lot of time and energy actually to fill that gap, or to emphasize that there is a gap and that we should like talk about it.
Right.
I mean, you know.
Right.
Maybe can we go back to pop culture, because I was supposed to be in Los Angeles, but then Corona came. Maybe I will go 2022. We will see. I was supposed to do research on entertainment and TV, actually, and the intersection with political discourse from a minority perspective. I don't know, you said like in Canada, you also watch a lot of US American TV. That's also the case in Germany, in Europe, of course, not only because Netflix comes from the US, but like pop culture, entertainment, that's like, there is a US hegemony. I wanted to focus on late night shows, for example, and understand how you can combine entertainment with political discourse and messaging. And I think, and I would be very interested in your opinion and perspective, for example, the newest wave of Black Lives Matter after the lynching of George Floyd was also based on this pop culture, popular programs trying to pack this very complicated issue into entertaining formats, and jokes and sketches somehow, and then interrupt them by saying, we are dying and Black people cannot breathe in this country. I don't know, does this kind of cultural production have an impact also on the discussion in Canada? Did you watch a lot of shows about this topic?
What do you mean by what type of cultural production was being
like for issues? We get a lot of information during the Trump era anyway from late night shows. Right. When we talk about Trevor Noah, for example, Amber Ruffin, we talk a lot about like sometimes also stand-up comedy formats at Netflix. Like this kind of stuff where a lot of people maybe in universities, professors would like say, no, thank you, this is not high enough for me. There we can talk about high and low maybe. Right. But how would you describe the impact of this kind of cultural production on public discourse when it comes to race, for example?
I understand what you're saying, because for instance, I read The Guardian quite a bit, and they actually have a regular column where they unpack what the comedy intros of the major network late night American shows, like what has Trevor Noah said? What did Jimmy Fallon say? What did Seth Meyers say? Right, etc. What did John Oliver say last night? And of course, a lot of them are explicitly political in their delivery and what they're thinking through. I think that comedians have a very important role to play, and I actually would not like to be a comedian right now because I think it's a very difficult terrain. I think in a way, Donald Trump is a gift to comedians. Many comedians have said that. In a way, he's a curse because he's so unreal that how do you make a satire out of what is already a satire? I mean, it's right. It's very difficult. How do you go further? Because usually comedy is going further than the acts of the thing that is trying to point at. And how do you go further than a Donald Trump, right? But also, I think it's difficult terrain often. So, with when you're trying to make comedy from race and racism and racial trauma, it's very difficult terrain. So I like hats off to those people who are attempting it, because I think they have a very important role to play, because in many cases, I think a lot of viewers and listeners will listen or watch them when they wouldn't, for instance, listen or watch us. So it's more palatable when Trevor Noah says something and turns it into a joke than when the two of us say it. And so that the people who, I guess, in a way most need to be reached can be reached through the different formats of different types of media and pop culture, as opposed to just the academic, straight, scholarly delivery. I think they have an important role to play. But I think it is dangerous too, because we're dealing literally with life and death. And you, for me, you use the right word. Like George Floyd was lynched. It's like in broad daylight with bystanders filming. Like it's horrific. It's horrific. It's traumatizing for the people. For Mr. Floyd is gone. His family is, I can't even imagine what they're going through. And then the people who witnessed it, and then even the people who had to witness it over and over again on like CNN. So there's so many levels of trauma too, especially for Black viewers, because we know that could have been our father, that could have been our brother, that could have been our son.
Anywhere, actually, not
that's only. That's the thing in Canada too, in the US, and in Europe. So I think, I think there's a role for the comedian, but it's very difficult because some of it is obviously explicit, like it's not funny. It's a horror show. And why are we still here, right? But I think part of it, especially for the comedians who provoke us to thought, I think they have a very important role to play,
Just so I understand, what do you mean by high and low art?
Absolutely. So back to art history. So art history traditionally, okay, being very canonical, traditional art history said, Mohamed, you can only study 3 types of art that they consider to be legitimate. And that was painting, sculpture, and architecture. And then within those 3, there were hierarchies of materiality. So for instance, the sculpture generally implied that the sculpture was going to be marble or bronze, right? Like, so if you were whittling away at wood, they'd be like, no, that's low art. That's not good enough for an art historian to bother to want to talk about, or for someone to bother to want to collect outside of, let's say, a folk art museum, right? If it was painting, we have a hierarchy within the actual paint. So oil painting was above watercolor. And then later you have the introduction of acrylic, okay? And then there's biases in material, like what is the ground on which you put the paint to, right? Typically we assume it's going to be a stretched canvas. So when artists started to take their canvases off of the stretcher or started to paint on other surfaces, that was like mind-blowing for people. It's like, what are they doing? You're supposed to stretch a canvas around a wooden frame, nail it, and then you paint, right? So when I say that I work in high and low art, this traditionally was very disruptive to art history and pushing at the boundaries, and opened up who could be an artist too, as you can imagine, because for instance, photography initially was not considered an art form, it was considered documentation, scientific technology, period. So it took time in the existence of the evolution of photography for it to be considered an artistic practice, right? So if you look at, for instance, 19th century photos, some people think that's not art, for instance. They think that's documentation, right? So it's often historical photography is considered low art or popular art because it's mass produced, right? So pop and low often go hand in hand too, because things, Mohamed, that were mass produced, like printmaking, right, was often considered low because more people could own it, because it was cheaper. Therefore, the snooty art historian said, I don't want to analyze the print because the painting, one of a kind, one artist's hand touching it, right? All that type of bias too, right? The touch of the artist. So we put these things now in quotes to indicate that we don't believe the hierarchies hold anymore.
Because the question is, when you go to the British Museum, for example, and you see a lot of wooden sculptures from Benin or from Cameroon, where to put this kind of art, actually?
Right. So part of it too, and even to back up a step, we have to understand a lot of that art was stolen, right? A lot of indigenous, African, indigenous, North American or American art that it is in European collections should be repatriated because it was gained through ill-gotten means. It was either confiscated, stolen. Like so for instance, in Canada, there's long histories of the federal government of Canada banning certain indigenous practices, cultural practices, confiscating their art and stealing it and putting it in Canadian museums. Right? So actually stealing the art from the people, telling them you can't make anymore, killing the art for the indigenous person too, because their art was made to be danced in, worn. It was meant to have a life cycle. It wasn't meant to be like shellacked and you call in the conservator and it never dies and you put it in a vault. That is against the practice of a lot of indigenous cultures around the world. The art was meant to live and die, right? So yes, so we have to think about that as well, to your point, Mohamed, in terms of how do the objects end up in these collections? Often to the nature of the displays in these collections is, to your point, Mohamed, anthropological. So they put it, for instance, in a glass case with labeling that does, in many cases, they don't know who the artist was because of the context in which the art was taken. They can't recuperate the name or even the community that produced the object. So the naming practice too is anthropological, whereas the naming practice of the art historical object, the art that's deemed to be art in the European or Eurocentric mode, is artist name is very, very important. That's first. Then the title, then the year, then the medium, then the dimensions, right? So you can tell too when they're trying to solve something in anthropological mode, because all that goes out the window and they use it for different ends to narrate a different type of anthropological story instead of an aesthetic story. which is what we get with Europe, right? So this is the problem too with what European and Euro-American, like Canadian museums do with indigenous art.
Maybe you know about the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. There's a big discussion about a new museum, which is going to open in a couple of weeks in a reconstructed old palace that was destroyed. And now it did cost millions of euros to build it again. And they want to put a lot of art from all over the world in this new museum, which is partly stolen or mostly stolen. But they came up with the term of shared heritage. I don't know if you heard about that. Like describing this art as it belongs to humanity. It's so important. Like when you talk about the old Egyptian stuff, for example, it's so important to civilization, to humankind, that you cannot claim anymore that it belongs to certain people, for example. Or you say, maybe you know the story of the Nefertiti here in Berlin, which people say was stolen from Egypt and brought to Berlin. The Egyptian government, which is like a problematic government actually, claims that it belongs to the Egyptian people. But a lot of German decision makers in this museum world would argue that this piece of art actually belongs to all of us. And we are going to make sure that it will be nicely put in, I don't know, a room here in Berlin so everybody can enjoy it. How would you comment on this shared heritage idea?
Well, here's the thing. To me, from what you're describing, the shared heritage concept is always going to benefit the European collection. Because let's just face it right now, most of the art that many of us would consider stolen ended up in European museums. So that's going to be a legal loophole through which they can lay claim to and keep these objects, as opposed to considering seriously returning them to the communities from which they were taken without the community's permission. So the other thing here too is I think we need to stop and think, okay, part of what art history does too is try to impose the same terms of engagement on what art is and what art should do and how long art should last on art of the world, as opposed to letting Europe have its ideas about what European art is and having other peoples and cultures and races have their ideas about what art is and should do. And again, for a lot of other cultures, this art that has been, again, stolen through, explicitly colonial processes too, like through things like slavery and colonization, for those indigenous cultures, the art was never meant to last forever. So then we have to ask, what does it mean then for a German museum or a German government to state, we're going to tell you that this thing should last forever, and we're going to have conservators preserve it in a manner that makes it last forever, and we're going to make sure that it is displayed in a manner that we believe all art should be displayed, as opposed to what you and your culture intended to happen to that art object, which may be that it should have been used until it disintegrated. What does that mean? So only then Europeans have the ability to tell the rest of the world what should happen to the rest of the world's art, right? So these are difficult discussions, of course, too, because there are many people from different cultures who would love to see these art objects and would appreciate that they get preserved. But at the same time, I think we have to have a balance and think about what the original initial cultures and their descendants want to happen to those objects too. Where's their voice in this? Yeah.
Well, if you would ask a scholar like Felwine Sarr, which is an interesting voice in the French-speaking world, he was asked by Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, to give some thoughts about whether France should let some art pieces travel back actually to the place of origin, and he came up with a plan actually, saying that of course you need to give it back because it does not belong in the Louvre or in Paris. And then he was cancelled, I think, by the French government because let's keep talking, but let's not move forward doing it. Actually, I was wondering, do you have similar discussions in Canada?
I believe so too, and especially around Indigenous, what we call First Nations art objects that were again confiscated by the federal government, and some of them ended up in European collections, or some of them ended up in Canadian, I think largely federal and provincial collections. So we've had discussions between Indigenous groups and nations and those different cultural institutions and the government about repatriating the objects, right? And those are the same issues that come up. Like, why should we as Indigenous people have to live by the rules of what you believe our art should now be or do?
Which is even more complicated because these people are living with you in the same country, actually.
Oh, right.
You are
Absolutely.
not talking about a government far away in Africa.
No.
You are talking actually about heritage, which was stolen somehow.
Right,
here.
Right. And we just went through a vast process that dealt with the parts of the different horrific infrastructure, genocidal infrastructures that were put in place by the Canadian federal and other governments, like the residential school system here, where Indigenous children for decades were literally kidnapped from their families and put in Christian residential schools. And there was horrific abuse that went on, sexual and other types of abuse in those schools. So we've been talking as a nation about how do we atone for the horror of those genocidal practices? And then what does it mean to fully understand Indigenous sovereignty? So if we say that Indigenous people have sovereignty within this nation and we acknowledge them as First Nations, right? That's another word we use in Canada. Then you're going to say, no, you can't have your art back. And by the way, if we give it back to you, you have to put it in climate control and use all these different methods that we Europeans have entrenched as best practice. What does that mean? Right?
Right.
Because again, in many cases, we're talking about hats, we're talking about different forms of dress, things that were worn and danced in and used in ceremony. They were never intended to be put under glass cases.
They're maybe not art in the narrow sense, actually.
Right, in the broadest sense, yeah, they absolutely are. Because here's the thing, a lot of European definitions of high art, again, in quotes, have to do with the praise of things that do not function other than to look at them. Whereas a lot of other cultures, art was something, you have a beautiful bowl, you put the soup in it and you also eat out of it.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's beautiful doesn't mean you put it on the wall. Right? Yeah, you know what I mean? So this is the thing, whereas the European highest forms of art standards that are embraced within the discipline and canonized within the discipline of art history were about things that don't function in the quotidian sense in daily life, right? And then things that were low, according to that problematic disciplinary perspective, were the things that functioned, and often they were things made by Africans and Indigenous people, right? So you see the bias there, right? So here's a case in point. Picasso, who's revered, is every time you turn around, there's another exhibition on Picasso because people believe him to be inexhaustible. Okay, so Picasso, who's this revered canonical Western artist, was collecting for a large part of his career African art. The African art he was collecting was not considered high art, but when he painted it into suddenly high art,
he translated it into
Please explain that to me, Mohamed. Explain that to me.
You are the professor. Please explain that to me.
You know what I'm saying? So the sculptures, the sculptures he had in his studio supposedly were not as valuable as his translation of them into oil paint on canvas. You see the bias we're talking about here?
Yeah.
Right. So his filter supposedly turned that African sculpture he was collecting into high art. And by the way, then he's credited amongst others with producing what then gets called modern art. Right.
Yeah.
And really that is it's the specific aesthetic of the African art he's collected that moves him towards abstraction. Right. Like let's face it. Right.
But I had the same idea I had a similar idea when I was just reading about French artists and authors traveling in North Africa, actually. They were translating actually cultural practices into this high art and brought this high art then back to Paris, which is interesting for me because it's like a daily practice that you can see. Or maybe if they were translating a poem that they heard in Algiers, for example, or Marrakesh, and they took it back to Paris, it became something valuable, actually, which is interesting for me, just how it works, that one thing does not have any value and the other thing is put in a museum, actually.
Listen, can I tell you, here's a perfect example of the Eurocentrism of art history and of Western ideas of art practice. So when we get to abstract expressionism, which a lot of people locate in New York City with people, who start to push back against the idea that there should be a three-dimensional perspective created on the canvas. So the truth then is that the canvas is flat and your painting should reflect the truth of the canvas's flatness. So you have people like Jackson Pollock who's doing his splash, his paintings like that, right? With body paintings, right? With the energy of his body. So all these mainly white men at that time are talking about the primitive energy it takes them to produce the painting. In their midst is an African-American who's often left out, even though he's a fantastic painter, Norman Lewis. And he refuses to go fully abstract, in part because as African-American, he felt that part of his responsibility was to reflect the histories of the nation as regarded other African-American or Black American populations. So when you look at his paintings, sometimes they look at abstract, like often white figures on a Black canvas. And at other times you're like, oh my gosh, this is hooded Klansmen circling a Black man about to lynch him, right? So one moment you see it just as white triangles, another moment you're like, no, this is a scene of racial violence. That's Norman Lewis's paintings, right? Because he refused to go purely abstract. The other thing I want to point out there, though, is while people like Jackson Pollock were talking about how he had to channel his primitiveness, right? This is a moment when Europeans, too, are still insisting that to be African is to be primitive, right? So what was Norman Lewis channeling then? If he was supposedly already primitive because he was already Black, right? So the bogusness too is that the tropes that are staged and set up are so Eurocentric that, of course, if they fundamentally excluded the idea of the person of color, the indigenous person, as a cultural producer that could be on par with the white male, right? Not just in the process of what supposedly you should be doing with a canvas if you decide to paint, but the fact of the way that they actually shut down the idea of who could be the artist, right? Because there they had a whole idea about the energy that was necessary to be an artist, which was masculine energy and which was primitive energy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So of course, too, who are the female abstract expressionists that we remember? Like, none of them are in the pantheon.
Yeah.
None of them are in the canon, right?
Yeah. We have two questions from the audience. Sherry Katz asks if you have an idea as to what the white people who have the power to steal art tell themselves as to why their actions are worthy.
Interesting question. I think, Sherry, that part of it is that you're able to justify it then through your buy-in to the idea of these definitions that we've been talking about. What is art? What is good art? What is high art? What is low art? What is art then that is irrelevant to me? What is art that is irrelevant, let's say, to an academic discipline like art history? So if you actually buy into that, then of course, then you think that your way of preserving that art is the only way, is the best way. And then for you, then the idea that an indigenous, let's say, gown or hat or rattle or drum, that it might be played until the skin of the drum wears out, is horrific, because your idea of art is must be put in a vault must have the conservator, must use chemicals or whatever to keep it going forever, like, or do our best to preserve it forever. That's your idea of what art looks like. Your idea of art is not, it has a life cycle. So if you're invested in only one perspective on what art is, and you take your perspective and your discourse and drop it on the world, then of course, anything that you get your hands on, you're going to think you can shove into your discursive structure of protecting that art. I think that's part of how it's justified, sadly.
Plus, there's, maybe if I may add something, sure. Here, at least in Europe, there's this argument that it's just more secure to have it here in Europe. We cannot return it to Africa because people there, they don't have the possibilities to secure this shared heritage, which is important for all of us. But me as a journalist, I look at the facts. And a couple of years ago, there was a flooding in the anthropological museum here in Berlin, and the whole, like the archive, a lot of art objects in the archive were destroyed, and they still counting what was destroyed, actually.
Oh, you're kidding.
That's the first thing. The second example is a couple of weeks ago, like I think 3 weeks ago or something, someone had a tour here on the museum island in the center of Berlin and just sprinkled olive oil on art objects like ancient Egyptian art, for example, which is weird. They don't know who did it, actually, but it's just like to unpack and deconstruct this security argument that I would love to say that all the art objects here are secure and not supposed to be harmed by anyone here, but it's not the case, actually.
For sure.
There's another question. Or Charmaine, do you want to add something?
No, I agree with your point. I agree wholly with your point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We spoke about Black Lives Matter, and Robin Camarota asks, the United States is tackling racial injustice, and some argue the movement which have taken place in recent months are the tipping point. Is Canada at the same inflection point?
Oh, great question, Robin. Again, I'd say Justin Trudeau's announcement, during he was giving a briefing, I think, on COVID, and they asked him about other things. And he said, yeah, absolutely. Canada is also being, a place we have to deal with systemic racism, root it out. I mean, I was like, finally. And I was also shocked that
was when he paused so long, right?
No, I think this was another case. It was another case. That was when he was being asked about, I think he was asked about something Trump had done, right?
Okay.
I think, right? But no, in this case, I think there was an incident, sadly, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our federal police, had harmed an Indigenous person, police brutality. And the head of the police, when asked about systemic racism, said she doesn't know what it is and she doesn't think it exists. And I was like, oh my God, how can you be the head of the police? And so then they asked Trudeau, I think, in a follow-up, and he was like, oh yeah, it does exist. So it's like, then I was wondering, should someone be heading the federal police in Canada if they don't know what racism is and don't know what systemic racism is? Even after we've just all witnessed again, photographic, video footage of police cruisers driving into Indigenous people. Like, are you kidding me? Anyway, he was cleaning up her mess, basically, when he said that, but I was still surprised that he said it. But to Robin's question, here's the thing. A lot of people point at America in terms of racial disarray and racial harms, and it's very easy to do because slavery existed there on a bigger scale, right? The enslavement of Africans went on since the 1600s there, but on a larger scale, especially in the South, because they had tropical, semi-tropical climates, and they had plantations where they're trying to grow things like rice and cotton, etc. Okay, so they actually the logic was we need more enslaved people to do this labor, right? And let's just point out that that's the reason why Canadians didn't have more enslaved people, because they didn't need more enslaved people, because we couldn't sustain an all-year agricultural economy here. It's not because they were nicer in Canada. is because they didn't need more people. Now, why do I say that? Because in America, Robin, it's like impossible to pretend that slavery didn't happen there. Like, you don't get white Americans saying, you're lying, slavery didn't happen here. You get that in Canada. Like, if I went outside and stopped 10 white Canadians on the street of Halifax and said, did slavery happen here? I'd be lucky if one of them said, yes, I know it happened here. That's how bad it is. Okay, so what's the knock-on effect? In the USA, yes, there's racial strife, but it's expressed differently, okay? So what I mean by that, my experiences of America are, okay, it's sad, but it's in your face, the racism. So you have the people who still want to run around with or put on their cars the Confederate flags, right? We're having that debate now, take down the statues of the supposed like heroes of the Confederacy. We're still debating that in America. But in the USA, people who are racist are not afraid to declare their racism, which in a strange way makes it safer for people like me, because I see you coming. When you have the Confederate flag on your truck, I know you might have a certain ideology, and I know I might want to not be around when you park your car. Do you get what I'm saying? In Canada, Mohamed, we have this British sensibility in most of the country, and then it's slightly different in Quebec. No,
I mean, she's
like,
your queen still.
Well, cheers, thank you. It's this British politeness nonsense. And what you have is people in Canada, white people are trained to know what to say to your face as a person of color, an Indigenous person. And then what happens when you leave the room is a different story. Okay, so the politeness is a veil over top of the racism that people feel and the Euro-Canadians discuss amongst themselves, right? And they can't not know because they're the ones that are doing it. Okay, can we be clear on that? When we talk about racism and infrastructures of racism, racism is not like in the air, it's enacted by human beings, right? Who put policies, regulations, structures in place, which they then have to enact. Right? So for me, then Canada, to Robin's point, we are behind. And I think the change will be slower in part because of, again, this nonsense idea that we're racially tolerant race-line society in the first place. The nonsense idea that colonial histories, colonization, slavery never happened here. And then add to that the veneer of Canadian politeness where people just don't know how to speak about race and racism. And so they cover it over with stupid platitudes.
So did I understand it right that you would argue that polarization is actually something good, because this is the nightmare of a lot of people here in Europe and especially in Germany looking at the US and saying we don't want to have that kind of society where you have these two groups, which is like very simple to say there are two groups. It's more diverse and complicated. For sure. But is it right that I understand that you would say, I want to see actually this polarization happening?
Here's the thing. I think as a Black woman who travels a lot, I feel safer knowing who the threat is. In the USA, I can identify the racist threat because they literally wear it on their bodies as symbols. In Canada, there's too many people who are practiced. Many white Canadians are practiced at the rhetoric of inclusion. Do you get me, Mohamed?
Yeah.
Talk like the two of us.
It reminds me of another country.
They don't mean any of it. They don't want any of it, okay? And so, but they're practiced at their polite veneer of, I know what the correct thing to say to you, and I don't wear the symbol of hatred on my body. So it's harder for us as Black people in this country to identify who is a threat. And sometimes, let's face it, the threat, when I say the racial threat or racist threat, sometimes that is physical. Sometimes that is a confrontation that will get you killed as a Black person. But it's easier to identify in the USA. So I do not like polarization, but what I find then when I go into the stage is I can identify the person who has those feelings because they're unashamed to put on the MAGA hat. In Canada, right? The Make America Great Again hat.
Yeah.
Trump, they're not going to put the hat on because they know that other Canadians would look at them and be like, what are you wearing that for? But they still have that in their heart. You understand?
Right.
So they'll still do the same crap to me that the American with the hat would do to me.
Maybe it's better to talk about something like toxic politeness in Canada.
Oh, thank you for that's a term. Oh God.
Please
Mohamed.
have it.
It is. Oh, yes. Yes. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it because it's a disingenuousness too. Right? So there's two things that goes on. There's a nodding, the yeah, oh, you want to talk about racism? Yeah. And the eyes is like, why are you talking about this? Because it doesn't apply to this. Do you mean America? You're really talking about America, right? So it's constantly we are constantly patronized as Black Canadians and Canadians of color, as people who could not possibly fathom our own existence, that we don't have a grasp on being able to narrate what's happening to us on a daily basis. Do you understand?
Yeah.
That is so annoying, and it's violent. It's violent that a group of people, my fellow citizens, are constantly doubting what I'm telling them about what my experiences are. Right? It's like, so if like when they say, oh, racism, you experience racism at McGill? It's like, how much time do you have? Sit down. How much time do you have for me to tell you what my life at McGill looks like? If you like, do you want to know or not? But then don't tell me that's not happening to me. And then don't tell me you don't know that it's not happening to me. Because the things that white people say together, alone, at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, or whatever, in the board meeting when there's no Black people there, are completely different than what they say when we're there. And they know that because they're in the room.
And often a lot of Black people and people of color tell me, or myself, we have to compare ourselves here, at least in Germany, with what's happening in the US, actually. Like, that's a race to the bottom. It's sometimes people would tell me in Germany, at least the police is not killing so many people here in Germany, like in the US. You know what I mean? It's like you have to keep up with this insanity, with these crazy stories coming out of the US, also, which are televised, which are put into comedy, which are put into sitcoms and movies and art. And when I say, but there is something systemic also here about racism, people would point often, white people would point often to the US and say, be happy that you're not there. You
see, and that's like, I think I was talking about my experiences at McGill the other day on the radio in Canada. And one of the callers called in and had a question. The producer asked me first and said, like, this person wants to know, if you're so unhappy, why don't you leave? And it's like, that's a quintessential racist question. So what are you saying? There should be no safe university for any Black professor in all of Canada. We should just be happy. Like, this is total slavery argument. This is slavery 101. Black person, be happy you have a job. Don't complain if you're experiencing violence on a daily basis inside an institution. Just be happy you have a job, right? Really? Yeah. Is that what you'd say to the white guy who's saying, like, I'm experiencing classism or something, like, on the job, because they're always talking about golf and skiing, and I can't get into the conversation because they're all talking about their clubs and their Porsches? Like, he's just supposed to deal with it, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing I hear all the time, right? And
plus, where are you supposed to go?
Think that's the thing. So do you not understand that what I'm describing at McGill is the state of Canadian academia, period? So what are you suggesting? That a Black woman with a PhD needs to leave the country to find a job where she can just be left alone to do her work and not be antagonized every day? Like, experience racial animosity every day? Really? So, like, but that's the kind of pushback you get, where it's the complete ignorance. And what that tells me too is there's still this feeling, of course, this is what racism is, where white people feel that they own everything all the time. Everything is always theirs. And then their experiences are the barometer of what experiences it is within that institution, the measure of the ideal of everything, right? And of course, you understand how whiteness operates, because, for instance, when I go back to talking about my white students at McGill, right, who are usually 90% of every class, they are used to seeing themselves everywhere on that campus all of the time, right? The books they read, most of the authors are given to read in any given class are white male authors, right? Some white female authors. The people at the front of the class always look like them. Do you think a white male student at McGill actually thinks, oh, could I be a professor? How could he not think he could, of course, be a professor? Because 95% of his professors in a 4-year period look exactly like him.
It's the natural thing to become,
it's
actually.
a natural state for him to think, of course I could do my PhD, right? But for the Blacks, do we understand that for the Black student, the Indigenous student, the Asian student, they're like, where am I on this campus? Right? Where's my question validated? How do I fit into this discipline? The professors never talk about anything about except Europe and Euro-Canadian content. How do I be here? Who do I become here? What can I become?
Also, the interesting thing that you mentioned that someone asks you where you're from, or people ask you where you're from. This is also a thing that happens often in Germany and never happened to me in the US. Even though my English is weird and I learned it by myself and stuff, people in the US tend not to ask this question somehow. They are racist, yes, but they they think all the people, they belong somehow to this country, you know? And then you have Trump, who is talking a lot about migration and migrants and stuff. But this is also the downside of this so-called migration societies, you know, that you have this norm that any non-white body does not belong someone. Somehow all non-white bodies came magically to Canada and Germany. Even we know that there was slavery in Canada happening, and people brought them against their will, for example.
Exactly.
Or there is a very long tradition and history of migration in Germany. One thing is interesting for me, because a lot of conservative, more right-leaning politicians here in Germany, they love the migration system in Canada. They actually are asking for the adoption of that system here in Germany, giving points to migrants and trying to, you know, put their skills in value. And
it's a very difficult system.
It's a very difficult system.
It's very difficult to get into Canada, become a Canadian citizen. Yeah, initially it's easier to come as a student, for instance, than to try to just migrate directly, depending on what your job is, what your salary is, what your educational background is. It's very difficult. So it's interesting if German politicians want to adopt the Canadian system.
But this is actually why I was jailed in Vancouver at the airport, because they thought that I'm coming to Canada to go underground and live there. And like my answer was like, it's a beautiful country, nice nature, but no, thank you. I mean, I'm fine. I'm good. But it's like, it's also like looking at non-white bodies as, you know, objects that you can move somehow and put points on them, value on them. Like, is it good now for us to bring this nurse to Canada or not, or let her come and work, actually, which is like also like a discussion that we have here in Germany, that they want to switch to this point-based system where you can guarantee that only good people come to your country. Which is, but
Mohamed, can I say, what you're saying is why in my book on marine landscapes, my 2016 book, Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica, I came up with this concept called imperial intrusion to try to position Europeans as intruders. Because what I find when you talk to the average European Canadian is, while they're asking me where I'm from, I'm like, well, where are you from? They never know. It's like, I think I have some Scottish, English, Irish ancestors. I mean,
they did the DNA test.
Like, well, not even. It's like they have no specific answer, but yet they know without a doubt that their whiteness makes them a Canadian. This is the problem. And even though, again, in talking to me, they don't understand how many generations I may or may not have. They don't have the history of slavery, so they don't understand the possibility of my Blackness being rooted here. And rooted here potentially more than theirs, right? But it's the fact then that through the process of colonization, French and British people came here, right? Dropped their discursive structures on top of Indigenous people, imposed them upon them, then, you know, forcibly enslaved and imported people of diverse African ancestry, and said, no, all of us are going to live by our rules, by the Europeans' rules, right? So then what happens then, again, is internally, and what we give to the world as Canadians, is that the default Canadian is always already a white Canadian, right?
Yeah.
That's what we export. Right. And that's what becomes the expectation internally too, sadly. Yeah. Right? So then everybody else is like, are you an immigrant?
Then you start acting white, actually, to become, then you start acting white to become a citizen or a part of that society. Then you start to do mimicry and adapt somehow, and you need to go and enjoy high arts, for example. You know what I mean? It's
right,
like it's,
right. In Canada, you have to go to Tim Hortons. I don't know if you know that.
Oh yeah, I know Tim Hortons, right? But I don't drink coffee, so I'm fine.
Oh well, you're in trouble. Okay. And you have to play hockey or love watching hockey, right? There's certain pastimes that are right, but more and more. But again, when you think of what is considered as quintessentially Canadian, a lot of them are actually Euro-Canadian pastimes, or they're actually initially Indigenous practices that Europeans co-opted and now pass off as white Canadian.
Yeah.
Right? Like sports like lacrosse, that's an Indigenous sport. Like snowshoeing, that's an Indigenous practice and technology, right? So things like that. So that switch too, when does that switch happen? When does the imperial intruder, when does the visitor get to position themselves as the citizen? And how is that done, right? Through the hierarchization of race and whiteness as the ideal subject, right?
Right. We have 3 more minutes and I have a last question for you.
Sure.
Did you actually find out the name of that woman in the portrait that you studied?
I did.
Can you share it, please?
Sure. And I could actually show you the portrait if you want.
Please.
Should I show? Okay, so I'll see if I can screen share here. Okay, so can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so that portrait here is a portrait of, so it's been renamed Mohamed, Portrait of a Haitian Woman, which I find very disturbing. I'll tell you why in a second. It was formerly circulated for centuries and decades under the title Portrait of a Negro Slave. And why, again, that's so problematic, of course, is that, I'll just blow it up here, sorry. Why that's so problematic, I'll just go through here, is that it was actually a painting of a woman that we know was owned by the artist. So of course he knew her name. Okay, so I was able to recuperate her name in part due to the brilliant research of other scholars of Canadian slavery before me, who determined that this man, Francois, and his white wife, he went off to Bordeaux, France to study at the academy there, met his wife, who was the daughter of his painting teacher, married her. They didn't go straight back to Quebec, though. They ended up in Saint-Domingue in the middle of the revolution. So Saint-Domingue was the name of the western portion of Hispaniola that became Haiti after the revolution. They end up there, Mohamed, and we believe that's where they purchased this woman and one other enslaved person who they forced to migrate back with them to Canada, to Montreal, okay? So we believe her name, because her name shows up in different documents in the archive in Quebec, was Marie-Thérèse Zemire. So one of the questions that I asked as art historian, why was her name not remembered somewhere on the portrait? Because again, it's typical for artists to actually inscribe somewhere on the back, usually the name of the subject, the sitter, what we call the sitter of the portrait. In this case, her name disappeared for centuries, right? For many, many years. And it had to be recuperated by scholars of slavery study like myself. Now, why I'm upset that the portrait was renamed? Because of course, I see this as a move by a Canadian museum to retroactively liberate her. So all of a sudden, although we know Mohamed, she spent a third of her life in Canada. She actually died in Montreal in the year 1800. So she would have spent a third of her very short life, 29 years, we believe, in Montreal. They name her only as Haitian, as opposed to Haitian Canadian or Haitian and of Quebec. And they remove the signification of her being enslaved. So if you don't have the background about her, that I'm imparting to people through my research and my lectures and things like that, people wouldn't understand that the exposure for a breast would have been against her will.
Yes.
She would have had no choice. She would not have paid model. The portrait was not hers. If Francois said to her, when he said to her, get to my studio, I'm going to paint you, take your breast out of your shirt, she had no choice. She was literally chattel owned by him and his wife.
And to be able to tell this story, actually, thank you so much for your work. To be able to tell this story, we need more Black women, we need more Black people, people of color, not only in social sciences, in all parts of knowledge production. Thank you so much, Charmaine. I really enjoyed the discussion with you. Let me just say what we are going to discuss next time. The discussion will be hosted by the Goethe-Institut Boston on December 9th at 12 p.m. Boston time with Max Czollek and I. We will speak with the anthropologist and with an anthropologist, and an award-winning podcaster about the role of Jewish and Muslim communities in contemporary society. Researcher Sultan Dogan and journalist and podcaster Rachel Cherotti approach the subject from very different perspectives. One is scientific and one is personal. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, Charmaine, again for your amazing work. I hope to see you soon, maybe in Canada, or if you are in Berlin, please let me know. And see you next time in Boston. Bye. Thank you.